Hi everyone and welcome to my talk for today. Hopefully we'll get to interact during the Q&A, but thank you very much for watching it and attending virtually. Also, thank you very much to Rita who kindly invited me to this workshop. Would have been much nicer to be in Barcelona. Would have been also my first time in Barcelona, but this apocalypse happened, and so here we are. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethics of genetic parenthood and designer babies. And during the course of my talk, you will realize that I'm not a very big fan of the label designer baby, especially when we talk about assisted reproductive technologies. And I will unpack a little bit my doubts. I should say that I'm Giulia Cavaliere from the University of Lancaster. I'm a lecturer there. I teach to medical students, but my research is more into the ethics of assisted reproductive technologies rather than clinical ethics. So before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit, as I said, about the label designer babies and when and how it comes about. So there are some technology, and some of them I've listed on this page, that when they are discussed in the news, but also sometimes on academic papers, they are considered technologies that they are there to create such designer babies, so this label. So the first one is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and the design would be that is due to the fact that there are a pool of embryos that are created with this technology. You know, probably audience to this talk will probably know much better than me, but there is, or pre-implantation genetic testing, there is a pool of embryos that are created, and then the test is done on genetic testing is performed on these embryos, and some of them are then implanted if they are mutation free, and some of them are either discarded or saved for future, frozen for future uses. So the reason why it's called designer baby is because it allows in a certain way to design the kind of children that we bring into the world by, for example, eliminating or discarding those embryos that carry a mutation and implanting those that instead they don't. Lately, so this label was also attached to mitochondrial replacement techniques, especially in the UK in 2015, and before and after the legalization of these technologies and their implementation into the clinic. There were lots of debates in the news about the creation of designer baby. This is not related to the fact that embryos are selected for certain traits, but rather because these technologies enable the creation of children that have the genetic material of three people, so a donor and the prospective parents. So mitochondrial replacement techniques are used to prevent the transmission of faulty mitochondrial DNA that can give rise to mitochondrial conditions or mitochondrial diseases. Usually the faulty mitochondrial is inherited through the mom, so the prospective parents, the woman. So the idea is that with this technology you can basically replace the mitochondrial DNA of the prospective mother with the mitochondrial DNA of a donor, or more correctly, more appropriately, you insert the nuclear DNA of the prospective mom, so of the woman, into the enucleated egg of a donor. So the resulting child will be created by the sperm of the father, the nuclear DNA of the mother, and the ovocytes and mitochondrial DNA of a donor. So designer, again, I'm not sure how accurate this label is, but the idea of designing is because there is this use of three people. They were also labeled three parents, babies, the baby born after this procedure. More recently and more controversially, this label was attached to genome editing technologies, especially in the debate around CRISPR-Cas9 and other and CRISPR genome editing technologies more generally. And the reason for this is that similar to PGD, so pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, these technologies can enable to edit, or could enable, because at the moment is neither allowed nor technically safe, at least, maybe it's technically possible but not technically safe. They could edit the genetic material of or the genetic endowment of embryos in vitro and then transfer in utero only the ones that have been successfully edited. So for example, imagine there are an embryo that has a mutation on a certain gene, and with CRISPR and other genome editing technologies, this mutation could be corrected, and then the mutation-free embryo can be implanted. Again, designer babies, because there is this intervention into natural reproduction, intervention into how we create babies. Now, the reason why this label is not great is that I think it puts all these technologies into one pot of technologies that are considered controversial, but it doesn't say much about the specific ethical issues that each technology raises, nor about the uses of these technologies and so on. So why the label designer baby is used is often in existing technology, but especially when a new technology comes about and there is quite a big controversy around it. And the reasons why these technologies are condemned or compared to eugenics sometimes, or labeled with, or the label designer babies is attached to them, is because these technologies are seen as problematic. Now, the reason why they're seen as problematic can vary. Different scholars have advanced different arguments. The first arguments that I would note and then I would find important is the against nature argument. So the idea that with these technologies we are tampering with nature, and we first of all shouldn't tamper with nature because whose responsibility it is if something goes wrong, but also what about the side effects. And there is also this component of like this hubristic urge to intervene into nature. So this is the first idea. The second idea is that all these technologies represent an iteration of what was eugenics in the past. So in the past there were, especially in the beginning of the 21st century and at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, I always mix them up, there were several attempts to intervene to the genetic pool or the genetic traits of the population, and all these endeavors were often called eugenics or considered under the label of eugenics. So now the idea is that these technologies are just basically a high-tech form of eugenics. In the past it was done by, for example, sterilizing women that weren't considered worthy of reproducing, or for example, encouraging, like in England, the reproduction among people, procreation among people that were considered fit. So this was like low-tech eugenics, and now is high-tech eugenics, but the aim, so this idea of creating the perfect population is still there, and this is what's seen as problematic. Now, the third argument is that is the idea of the right to an open future. You might have heard of it, but it's this idea that we intervene into the genetic endowment of a future being, and this future being, when it comes into the world, will have a predisposed set of traits, and there's a lot about agency. So people have, scientists or prospective parents have influenced the kind of person that he or she will become. So these arguments are often portrayed or often advanced to criticize these technologies and say, well, we shouldn't allow them, we shouldn't implement them, or criticizing certain uses of these technologies. So for example, with PGD, there was a huge debate about whether, for example, it could be acceptable to use this for severe monogenic conditions. So for example, one of the most severe could be thought to be, for example, Huntington disease, but a bit more problematic to be used, for example, for predisposition. So for example, for selecting against breast cancer predisposition, and even more problematic, even if it's neither completely possible, nor allow this selecting against, for example, traits like, I don't know, high IQ, height, and all these other traits that can confer an advantage. Now, so I said, certain uses of the classic therapeutic use of this technology is not really a therapy, but the idea of like correcting mutation by eliminating those that carry the mutation is considered more acceptable than, for example, doing a selection based on traits that are not normally considered as disease. Now, I have a couple of objections which are partly mine, partly they are found in the literature on assisted reproductive technologies and on the ethics of these technologies. So the first one is the Against Nature article. I think, so first I should say that all these arguments, even if I personally disagree with many of them and I don't think they are very sound arguments, I still think they are very important to be introduced in the debate. And the reason why they are so important is that even if we debunk them or we disagree with them and therefore argue against them, it's still important to get the intuition behind the argument and include it into our discussion on assisted reproductive technologies, because we can learn something from such intuition. So we can find ways to implement it, so go against this argument, but maybe do them in a way that is more ethically sound or more just, so that also, for example, includes fairness issues or other ethical considerations. So, as I was saying, there are a couple of objections that can be moved against these arguments. The first one, well, with nature, I think the intuition behind is that there are lots of there is like a sort of like unplanned or side effects that can happen into intervening in nature, and sometimes we might do it a bit too in a Cavaliere sort of way. But at the same time, not a lot of our medical processes or of medicine more general is natural. So we constantly cure disease, intervene to stop disease. And for example, also with vaccine children, we try to avoid that people die prematurely and so on. So in a sense, this technological development in assisted conception is something in line with technologization of medicine and the attempt to avoid that nature, let's say, takes its course. The second argument regarding eugenics, and it was a lot something that I discussed into my PhD, which was about the ethics of using eugenics in debates on assisted reproduction and the similarities and difference between past and future. So I think, so the argument that one could answer, well, there are significant differences between past eugenics and present genetic technologies. First of all, there is much more attention towards the individual, so it's not the state that decides that all children with a certain disability or a certain mutation should not reproduce. It's not the state that mandates assisted reproductive technologies such as or using PGD in combination with assisted reproductive technologies. So they say that it is much more of individual focus. That said, I think it's important to take into account this argument, because we could still foresee a scenario whereby many people, the sum of individual decisions brings about a world that is in a way very similar to what was conceived and what was hoped by past eugenicists. The third argument is that, toward a response to the right to an open future argument, is that in a way we still shape children in a non-technical way. So for example, bringing a child to play, I don't know, volleyball as opposed to football, or making them attending like a music lesson or music lessons instead of playing sports, or instead of playing, I don't know, chess. These are all choices that parents do that in a way shape their children. So the argument goes, there are all these choices that are considered acceptable. Why is not acceptable to, for example, shape children's future in a way that, for example, saves them from having genetic conditions, or that design them in a certain way? So again, these arguments are often advanced as a response to the critics in order to advocate for existing technologies. So for example, say that we should use PGD, or when mitochondrial replacement was a lot in the news and discussed in the media and in academia, that we should implement mitochondrial replacement techniques into the clinic. Now, with respect, also the second reasons why these arguments are advanced is also to expand the application of existing technology. So we could foresee, for example, for PGD, not only for severe conditions as it is in many countries like Germany, or for example more recently in Italy, but also expanding it to other conditions that are less disabling or that are only predisposition, as I mentioned the example of breast cancer before. So there are different ways why these arguments are used, but generally to bring about a certain idea of how this technology should be implemented and used. With respect to mitochondrial replacement, for example, one of my colleagues and I were talking about using them to enable lesbian couples to share the genetic material they pass on to the baby. So one party of the couple could provide the egg as a donor, and the other party, as the donor does in the normal process, and the other party of the couple, the nuclear DNA. This is not possible, but this is a way, an example of advocating for an expansion of using of existing technologies. Now, what I was talking about at the beginning, that I'm a bit skeptical as to the value of using these labeled designer babies at all, is that often it's very interesting intellectually to discuss about these fashionable and also in a way futuristic uses of certain technologies that enable us to design like a baby with blue eyes and blonde hair and very tall and with slim legs and whatever the beauty or the unfortunately the paradigm is sorry for beauty or for success in life. So this is something that is a bit fanciful in a way, but what happens in the fertility clinic, again, probably you know much more than me, is rather that couples don't really want the perfect child, don't really want the designed baby. They want they want a child that is genetically related to them and that is also healthy. And I'm putting emphasis on these two terms, and for the rest of the talk I'm going to focus on genetic relatedness, because these couples, or this couple of single reproducers that go into the fertility clinic could have children in other ways. They could, for example, adopt, or they could, for example, use an egg donor instead of using, I don't know, PGD or mitochondrial replacement. They could use a sperm donor if the DNA with the mutations is on the men's side. So there are all sorts of ways why people could have children that are healthy, or they could, for example, adopt. This is also a very non-technological way to ensure that you have healthy children. But what these technologies enable prospective parents, in general people, to do is to have children that are genetically related to them and healthy. And this is why I think that the reason why we have reproductive technologies at all, if we think, for example, even at the inception, like with IVF, so at the very beginning of assisted reproduction, this was created to enable people to have their own quote-unquote children. Now, there are several arguments, and I am focusing on two in favor of enabling people to have genetically related and healthy children. The first one is something we value in a democratic society and in liberal democratic societies, is that what we value is people's freedom to decide what to do with their life and how to live their life, so long as they don't cause harm or risk causing harm to others. And this is something that was this is a principle that was first introduced by John Stuart Mill and can also be applied to discourses and discussions on assisted reproduction. So the idea of reproductive freedom is that people should be free to decide how many children they have and also what kind of children they have in countries that allow assisted reproductive technology, so long as they don't cause harm to others. Now, this is something, as we are saying, like this is a principle that is not absolute. So, for example, if these technologies wouldn't be safe, for example, for the future children, this would be considered, or could be considered, even if is a very controversial assumption and with metaphysical implication that I won't go into this talk. But let's say that the child born as a result of assisted reproduction could be harmed or wronged. And so there are limits. Or for example, if we think about distribution of resources, it could also be problematic. But let's say in general, people should be free to decide what to do with their life and what kind of children they have. Now, with respect to, for example, the genetic technologies and assisted reproductive technologies that I was talking about, an argument from reproductive freedom would say that people who want to have genetically related children and these technologies are there and available, they should be able to use them, even if there are other people in society that consider this technology problematic, or the desire of parents to have a genetically related child as something that is not of fundamental importance. Now, the second reason why, and is related to the first, why these technologies are defended and why people desire for genetic relatedness is considered important and should be fulfilled, is the relationship. So this is like welfarist theories in political philosophy, but it's the relationship between desire, satisfaction, and well-being. So this is a very fanciful way to say that if I want something very strongly, my life would be better if I achieve rather than if I don't achieve that. Now, I could want very strongly, for example, oh, I love mountains, so to be taken with an helicopter at Lukla airport in Nepal and start hiking towards the Himalaya. But this is not something that, I mean, even though it will definitely increase my well-being, this is maybe something that is considered a desire that the state, for example, shouldn't invest resources to enable me to have, whereas, for example, having children by many is considered a desire that warrants the investment of resources, the allocation of resources to enable me to have. And the reason why certain desires are considered more important than others is, first of all, for personal reasons, so that these really matter for the person more than other desires that the person can have, and also that they are can be shared by rational people engaging in a discussion. So, for example, I think I will have a harder time to convince people that, for example, don't hike that the state should fund my desire to fly to Lukla airport, whereas it should be easier to convince people that the state should fund assisted reproductive technologies. So these are the two arguments in favor of enabling people to access assisted reproductive technologies, and also sometimes that the state devotes or allocates resources to enable people to do so. Now, there are also still some objections that remain that are related to the one before, but not only. So even when these technologies are just used to enable people to have genetically related children that are healthy, there is a first objection that is often moved by what are called often disability scholars. And what some of these scholars say is that by using these technologies and by, in a sense, reducing the number of people that are born with a certain disability, the level of support that is now granted to people with that disability can decrease. So, for example, if we think about Down syndrome, one of the most common examples and one of the conditions that with prenatal testing is being reduced, and there are certain countries like Denmark or Iceland where for a couple of years there were absolutely no birth of children with Down syndromes. So the critique would go, well, by reducing the numbers, by using this technology to reduce the number of children that are born with a certain disability, say for example Down syndrome, we we go down a slippery slope where the state at some point will not fund, for example, schooling or benefits or help for these children and for when they become adults. Another version of this critique is the idea that by selecting against certain disabilities, so for example by selecting against Huntington disease and using PGD to avoid the transmission of these traits, or using prenatal testing to avoid the birth of people with Down syndrome, we're sending the state sends a message to people currently living with those disabilities that their life is not worth living. So there are different versions of this objection, but the core of this objection is the idea that disability for some people is a part of their identity, and using technologies to reduce the amount of people born with that disability either makes these people feel like their life is not worth living or risks in a consequentialist way, risk a decrease in the number of services available to them, to existing people with that disability. The second argument against funding reproductive technologies and allowing reproductive technologies is the idea that there are alternatives for these people to become parents that do not entail such a big amount of resources that need to be allocated to these parents. So to these people to enable them to do that. So for example, if we think about mitochondrial replacement techniques, and there was research involved to create these technologies, to test them. Now they're implemented into the clinic, so can be accessed by couples. And the idea is that, well, there are alternatives. So for women carrying faulty mitochondrial DNA, there were existing alternatives, as for example, using egg donation. So not using their own eggs, but using the whole egg of a donor. Or for example, with genome editing technology, there was a big debate because why do we need to edit embryos in vitro when we already have PGD that in most cases, not all cases, works to select embryos that are mutation free. So the idea is that there are alternatives to become parents, and also many of the scholars advancing this critique also say, well, there are also non-technological alternatives such as adoption. So there are other ways to become parents. Why do we need to allocate so much resources, or do we put at risk the life of future people just because we need a new technology? The third argument is a bit different in the sense that it doesn't necessarily criticize these technologies, but it criticizes the underpinning norms that in a way shape people's decision to access them. So for example, the idea is that in society, what is considered the optimum in terms of parenthood is not adoption, is not a disabled child, is not a child that is not genetically related to them, but is all the opposite of this. So it's a child that is healthy, that is related to his parents or her parents, and that lives a healthy life. So these norms, in a way, shapes people's decision to access reproductive technologies, and at the same time, they make them go through all these hurdles in order to achieve this optimum in terms of parenthood. Now, I have a couple of answers to this to this objection, sorry. And what I want to bring, and I'm bringing also my talk to a closing, is that I think it's important to start with the assumption that the liberal arguments in democratic, so liberal defenses of reproductive technologies are in line with how we organize society. So I think there is a presumption in favor of liberty that should also be applied in assisted reproduction. So if we think about the critiques before, while it's true that there are potential negative effects for people with disability, or they might feel that this technology shouldn't exist, I think it should be down to parents whether they want or not want to raise a child with disability, and therefore whether they want or not want to access these technologies. Despite this, I think it's very important to consider that if people with disability advance this argument, is probably also because they feel discriminated, they feel that they don't have enough support. So I think we should work in parallel, and in a sense, on the one hand, appreciate that people should be free to decide on what they want to do in terms of procreative projects, but at the same time not forgetting that people with disability are constantly discriminated, and finding ways to combat this or to reduce this discrimination at least. The other argument that I would present in response of the objection is that in a way, while adoption could be considered an alternative, or while there are all sorts of alternatives to assisted reproductive technologies, unfortunately, the only people that need to sacrifice are people that are already at a certain disadvantage. So are people that are carrying a genetic conditions, or people, for example, in same-sex couples and same-sex relationship that could not reproduce without these technologies. So in a sense, I think it's unfair to ask only one part of the population to adopt or to use alternatives, whereas everyone else can just reproduce without thinking twice about it. Now, my last comment on social norms, I think that this is an extremely important critique of, for example, liberal arguments in favor of assisted reproduction, because it's not entirely true that people are simply free to decide. There is a big component of social norms shaping people's decision, and I think it's very important to take into account how certain procreative projects, so for example having a genetically related and healthy child, are preferred over others. So at the same time, adoption is very, very hard to access, and many people are not eligible to adopt, so this also shouldn't be considered a very easy alternative. So one way to combat these social norms is, for example, promote other ways of family formations, and for example increase people's, or enable a bigger amount of people to access, for example, adoptions or other non-technical form of reproduction. So just to conclude my talk, and I'm bringing this to an end, I think it's important to operate on two levels. So on the one end, we need to try to enable people to fulfill their desires with respect to assisted reproduction or procreation more generally, but at the same time remembering that there are these social norms, that people with disabilities are stigmatized, and that it's true that resources are limited and need to be allocated in a rational way. So I think the liberal arguments should be the starting point, but all these critiques are very important in the way we defend reproductive technologies, and also in the way we then talk about all these other issues surrounding reproductive technologies. So this is why I'm advocating to change also the discourse from this label of designer baby or these critiques that something is unnatural or eugenics, and focusing on the specific ethical issues that each technology raise, in order to address whether the problems lie with the technologies itself, or in the way it's implemented, in the way it's defended, in the way it is used. So this was it. So thank you very much for virtually attending my talk. I hope you made it till the end. If so, you deserve a present, which I don't have. You have my gratitude. If you want to email me, below is my Lancaster email address, which I check very frequently, as you can imagine, and the other is my Twitter handle. I'm also on Twitter, so please tweet or email me. Otherwise, I'll see you all during the Q&A session, at least hopefully. Thank you very much. Bye.